If the governments are complaining that they are unable to access vaccines, then how are private companies and private citizens getting them? We're talking vaccines again for the some amount of multiple times, and it's not a shocker because the vaccines are how we say we are going to get out of this pandemic again. So if we are to find a way out of the pandemic, we have to find a way to get these vaccines. Of course, the vaccines are the focal point, the main issue for a lot. And the vaccines are what can make the lockdown measures that we are currently facing, that we see that many islands cannot continue to hold up for much longer, and many people are already feeling the strain and feeling like their knees are buckling under the strain. The vaccine drives are how we are going to get out of this, or at least the proposed method to how we get out of this. So we want to find out how we get more vaccines. Many of the prime ministers, the prime minister of Jamaica, our prime minister here in Trinidad, they are complaining, the prime minister of Barbados, they are complaining that the distribution of vaccines on a global scale is inequitable. And they aren't the only ones complaining about this. Even some people within some of these first world countries, some companies, PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, the complaint is all around the world that many of the smaller countries, many of the smaller states are unable to get access to vaccines. Some of them are trying to get to buy them, and they are unable to buy them. In Trinidad here, we heard our supermarket association and some of the business associations offer to help the government to buy these vaccines. And when I heard this, I was wondering, why would they offer to help the government to buy vaccines when the government has made it clear that the problem is they can't get the vaccines in the first place? So what exactly are they offering to buy? But then, really, what are they offering to buy? Because I don't think they are ignorant of the fact that vaccines are scarce across the world. These people are business people. They understand the idea and the workings of supply and demand, and they understand that you cannot acquire something if there's no supply of it. So if they are offering to buy it, then do they have access to it somehow? If you think back to March, you remember that Ansa McCall offered to purchase some vaccines on behalf of our country. So where were they going to purchase these vaccines from? It seemed like the arrangement to purchase the vaccines was pretty sure, and the procurement of the vaccines wasn't the problem in terms of accessing it, that the problem was the final financial arrangement towards it. So then, where was Ansa McCall going to source these vaccines from? And if they were going to source these vaccines, why is it that our government can't reach out and source the vaccines on their own behalf? Why is it? What is causing there to be in the world right now the reality that seems like vaccines are at one moment inaccessible to countries and states and entire government bodies, and we'd suppose that they have a lot of power. But then you see that it seems like vaccines are accessible to private citizens, and we're seeing that some of the more well-known names within the Caribbean in terms of private businessmen obviously seem to have some access to these vaccines that even the state and other government bodies are unable to match up to. The Prime Minister of Jamaica, Andrew Holness, recently was speaking in a conference for Africa Day. Africa Day was the 25th. To be quite honest with you, I didn't know that was Africa Day. I feel badly about it, being that some of my ancestors would have come from Africa. You know, the whole question of ancestors is a strange one because pretty much everyone agrees that humans came from Africa. If you believe that humans were created, you believe they came from Africa. If you believe they evolved, you believe they... Anyway, I digress. The 25th was Africa Day, and the Jamaican Prime Minister used this moment. Prime Minister Andrew Holness calls for greater access to COVID-19 vaccines. And as we get further into this, if you like the video, like the content, go through and like some more videos. I have quite a few videos there. I'm trying to maintain my one a day, and they're nearly reliably being posted at 10 a.m. So look out for them then. Subscribe, click the notification bell so you'd have that little alert when the videos drop. And comment, tell me what you think. And if you think you learned something and there's something valuable in the video, please do share it. Share it wherever you can and allow the channel to grow. Prime Minister Andrew Holness calls for greater access to COVID-19 vaccines. No one should be left behind is the message from Jamaica's Prime Minister Andrew Holness regarding the global distribution of COVID-19 vaccine. The Prime Minister continued, "It cannot be morally justified that rich countries, many of whom gain their wealth and scientific advantage through the exploitation of Africa and its people, now use this wealth and scientific advantage to hoard and stockpile vaccines while the poor and historically exploited and deprived countries wait in uncertainty to access equitable and consistent supplies, their populations at risk and their economies on pause," Mr. Holness said. And he would understand this completely because Jamaica, along with Trinidad, are both in positions where they have felt the negative effects of having to pause their vaccine drives and the slowing effects of it because of inaccessibility to more vaccines. So he's speaking from that experience. These countries and these leaders have been saying that they have been trying their best, they have been reaching through all possible and legal channels that they can reach through, and they cannot access any vaccines. In Trinidad, we have our private sector even involved, saying they are willing to back and willing to help. Private sector still willing to help acquire vaccines. The private sector remains committed to helping the government acquire COVID-19 vaccines for the population. Supermarkets Association of TT President Rajiv Dipti made this comment on Thursday. This article is back from the start of May, and the 6th of May, he was speaking there even after the whole drama with the Ansa Makal group, where they said they were approached by the government to procure and purchase some vaccines. That entire series of events created some very interesting back and forth, and Samakal saying they were initially approached by the government saying they didn't approach anyone, and Samakal saying that all they wanted was the foreign exchange to do the purchase, the government saying that they actually wanted 8 million and some foreign exchange boosts and some tax write-offs, and that they weren't going to give them that, and they do not have the money for that. But then after that, I believe the health minister then said that they did actually have the money, and that money wasn't a consequence in this, and that money was irrelevant. So the back and forth had, to be quite frank, somebody along that chain within that bit of communication wasn't being quite upfront with the truth. The two sides were saying things that were contradicting each other, and the two contradictory claims couldn't have been true at the same time. Anyway, either way, the Supermarket Association remade that offer to the government that we as the private sector are willing to help purchase the vaccines if so needs be. The supermarket head said, speaking despite the crisis, notwithstanding this, Dipti said this is not stopping efforts to source WHO-approved vaccines for the population. There's a very detailed deployment plan already laid out for on-the-ground logistics in terms of receiving, distributing, and administering vaccines. All relevant protocols observed. We also note the Prime Minister's appetite for collaborative private sector involvement, as this is an indication to us there can be a strategy for a parallel vaccination program. He said vaccine success is no indicator of economic success, but the two would deeply intertwine to give any prescription of hope to our nation. And that's what we keep hearing. If we are to find a way out, we have to find vaccines. Find vaccines, find the way out. We want a way out, we have to find vaccines. So it seems to me the thing that makes most sense is that vaccines should be at the top of every discussion topic when we're dealing with the pandemic in Trinidad and Tobago. Because if we do not yet have enough vaccines to vaccinate our entire population, that's the sticking point we are at. When we acquire all the vaccines to vaccinate the entire population, then we could probably look to make sure that everyone takes these vaccines. But we don't even have enough vaccines to vaccinate everyone who wants to be vaccinated yet. So we need to find these vaccines. And if these private sector companies are saying they are able to find the vaccines, what is the problem with them? Why are we not working with them? Well, the Prime Minister gave a reason for that. He said that when they approach these private sector companies, they don't get a good and clear answer as to where these private sector companies are going to get their resources from. In one of his more relaxed shirt press conferences back in March, he made that point.
As the head of the government of Trinidad and Tobago responsible for the population in this matter, we could say without contradiction to the population that we've made all reasonable approaches to AstraZeneca India and other authorized suppliers, and there's no vaccine available for purchase. All the people who are telling you about they have $1 million here, or $3 million or $5 million there, have turned out to be people you want to stay far from. The fact is, it is not available in commercial trade. There's not one single CARICOM country that has been able to buy a dose of vaccine. That's an undisputed fact.
Now, personally, I'm finding those statements more and more strange when I think about it, because this was already after the Ansamakal group and the Sabgas had already offered to procure 351,000 Pfizer vaccines for US 8.4 million for use by the public. This was after this news had already broken. So is it that the Sabgas were sourcing these vaccines from inappropriate sources? Is it that they were running some black market deals? And is it that the government was at one point in time willing to deal with them in this black market deal? And then am I to believe also that they're announcing to the public they have the ability to procure these vaccines and they are going to do so illegally? Are they really doing that? I am not sure. One thing that does seem certain to me is that these private companies are not bluffing and they can actually procure vaccines. PM reveals the private family who gave him the Moderna vaccine. This story is coming out of Antigua from May the 15th. The Antiguan Prime Minister, way back in January, got vaccinated. Back then, it was a mystery how he got vaccinated. No one quite knew how he was able to access the vaccine that early. And it was the Moderna vaccine, which is also extra strange considering that the country of Antigua, the island of Antigua, was vaccinated predominantly with the AstraZeneca vaccine. He took the Moderna vaccine and the island was vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccine. But that wasn't the only problem there. How did he access this Moderna vaccine? Well, he eventually came out and said, nearly 5 months after receiving his first vaccine dose, Prime Minister Gaston Brown has revealed the source. He told listeners on Point FM that the Moderna vaccine was brought in by the Hadid family. The Hadid family is one of the more prominent Syrian families in the Antiguan island. And there are some who say that there are links to our Syrian families in Trinidad and that vaccinations occurred inter-family because of that. I don't know, and quite honestly, I don't care. That's a bit of conspiracy that is inconsequential in the large scheme of things, because what we can say for sure is that they did get the vaccine and that they can get the vaccine and that they got the Moderna vaccines. And to me now, it's curious. The Prime Minister of one of the islands in CARICOM took this vaccine that was acquired privately. Whatever channel was taken to acquire this vaccine, can't it be taken for our island and for other islands to access the vaccines also? Is it that it's too expensive? If it's too expensive, well, at least let us know that. Because the excuse that it's inaccessible now is making less and less sense. Out in Taiwan tech execs look to buy COVID vaccines as cases surge. Out from Taipei, key Apple supplier Foxconn, that's the company that had to put catching nets outside of their factories. They supply manufacturing to Apple, and the conditions within their factories were so horrible that some people were known to try to see if they can fly out from the windows in the factories. And instead of make the conditions better, they placed nets around the building. Anyway, Foxconn and other big Taiwanese tech companies are attempting to purchase COVID-19 vaccines in a bid to keep business running smoothly amid a recent spike in coronavirus infections. So, how are these companies aiming to buy these vaccines if they cannot be bought? Again, in India, we see that private companies are now free to buy vaccines at market price for employees. The Indian government is opening up the industry and allowing private companies to buy these vaccines. So if the government can open it up to allow private companies to buy the vaccines, then why can't the government open it up to allow themselves to buy these vaccines also? That's a piece that I wasn't too sure of, but the Barbadian Prime Minister shone a bit of light on it. During an address that she made to the International Economic Forum on Latin America and the Caribbean, she said that it cannot be that countries that are here have to be the victim of middlemen in circumstances where global pharmaceutical companies are saying they only deal with countries, but in reality, they have dealt with very few of the small countries, but have had small countries having to deal with middlemen who are selling the vaccines at a premium. So these vaccine pharmaceutical companies are lying. And that's not coming from me, that's coming from the Prime Minister of Barbados. That accusation is from her. She says the pharmaceutical companies are lying. They say that they're only dealing with countries, but no, they're actually dealing with middlemen and other businesses, because what seems obvious, what seems apparent, is that private companies can access the vaccines. And these same large pharmaceutical companies are the same companies that are fighting tooth and nail to make sure that the patent agreements are kept and are not lifted, because they do not want to endanger their intellectual property rights. So they are the only manufacturers of these vaccines. And as the only manufacturers, they can be sure that any vaccines that are produced must have been produced by them. So can they tell us now, if they are saying that they are only supplying to countries, can they tell us how come these private companies are getting this? This is a question that I really want answered. I have no doubt that there may be a simple answer, there may be a logical answer, there may be an answer that doesn't involve corruption, but I'd like to know it because I do not know it, and apparently it seems like the Prime Minister of Barbados doesn't know the answer, the Prime Minister of Jamaica doesn't know the answer, the Prime Minister of Trinidad doesn't know the answer either. So all four of us, I am in esteemed company here, all four of us would like this answer. How is it that vaccines from pharmaceutical companies that say they want to continue being the exclusive producers of this vaccine, and they are the only producers of these vaccines, and they only give these vaccines to countries, how is it that these same vaccines now end up in the hands of private companies and private people? There's a lie somewhere along the line. Okay, then maybe our government can greenlight the private companies to go free sheet and buy wherever they can access these vaccines. Maybe not wherever they can access these vaccines, but if they can somehow prove that these vaccines are up to mark, if there is some kind of quality control, maybe we can allow private companies to go out and access these vaccines. And as the private companies access it, the vaccination drive will just increase in our country. So that may be an alternative. But in Trinidad, that is not being allowed. And I am not sure of the reason why it's not being allowed here. We'd have to ask our government for that, and hopefully they'd give us their answers on that. But there are reasons for it. Why the private sector should not be allowed to purchase the COVID-19 vaccine. A limited budget is a major challenge for COVID-19 vaccination efforts in many developing countries. The idea of allowing the private sector to buy the vaccine has been proposed by some as a solution. There's a large debate on whether private companies should be allowed to buy the vaccines, especially for those countries that have been hit hard by the pandemic. In Indonesia, businesses will be allowed to buy the vaccines along with the government. According to the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, there have been more than 5,000 firms registering to purchase the vaccines. Similarly, the Thai government gave a green light for the private sector to participate in the vaccine scheme, with private hospitals and pharmaceutical producers being the two most active sectors seeking approval. On the surface, this strategy sounds effective with more resources on hand, allowing for more people to be vaccinated in a shorter period of time. However, when we take a closer look, the approach may have some potential drawbacks. So, what are the potential drawbacks that they identified? The profit maximizing preference of the private sector over social benefits. If we leave social issues up to just matters of profit, we can see some scary things happening. If your only motivation is profit and I cannot provide you with any profit, then you have no motivation to help me. So in a case of large-scale social benefits, leaving it up to profiteering only may be risky. What if their profit maximizing nature is eliminated? And this is where I see one of the more interesting points. The point that they are making is that the supply right now of the vaccines is limited. It's constant, it's inelastic. The supply is about as high as it can be. And the demand for it potentially is extremely high. So if we open up now the private sector to be able, the private companies to be able to deal directly with suppliers, very likely what would happen is the only curve that would get a change is the demand curve. And if the demand curve gets a spike and the supply curve cannot change, what is going to happen is the price is going to spike, the price is going to increase. The solution that was proposed in that article was that we leave it up to governments to secure the vaccinations, and people and private companies can only access vaccines through government. But then the problem with that is that we're back to where we were at the beginning of this, that the governments cannot purchase these vaccines. And it seems like only the private companies have the ability to purchase the vaccines. So what do we do then in the pursuit of vaccinating our population and seeing that we escape this pandemic? Because the pandemic has a worse with time effect. The longer you stay under the grips of this pandemic and the lockdown measures that some think are required to keep it under control, the worse your economy is going to get. So people aren't only dying from the pandemic, your economy is being battered as this goes on. So the vaccines aren't only a matter of health, they are a matter of wealth too. So now in that balance, can we say that it is worth it to still risk opening it up for the private companies to go out and procure these vaccines? And okay, if it bloats the market, so be it, but at least we get the vaccines in the short term. Or maybe what Cuba is doing, what GlaxoSmithKline is doing by producing more vaccines and increasing the supply side of this curve, that may be the solution out of all of this. And I hope that supply curve can increase faster and faster and eventually surpass the demand that is needed, and we vaccinate the whole world and live happily ever after. But until then, what do you think is the better idea? Should the government remain in control of trying to procure these vaccines and continue to depend on other governments donating it and trying to work through the COVAX facility while Canada is scraping off extra vaccines from the COVAX facility? Should we remain there with the governments trying to fight up with that? Or do we now allow the private companies to go out and do that through whatever channels, whatever approvable channels, of course, whatever healthy channels? Do we allow them to now do that? Tell me what you think. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.
When you wake up in the morning and you hear the